cope with an income decrease. They save less on leisure. They stopped delaying obligatory payments, but people start saving on food, which is a negative signal. And also, for the first time over a long observation period, we can see a high share of people who use their savings or make their savings. And in general, I would say that this is typical not only for those who see income decline, but also for Belarusian households in general. They save less and they do not want to save more. Now we can see the Consumer Confidence Index comprising 5 components. The first two are about the economic situation in the country. Previously, Belarusian households traditionally valued their financial standing better than the general situation in the country. Today, it changes. About 52% of respondents believe that the financial situation in the country is worse or neutral. It used to be different. The majority would say that the economic situation worsened. Today, we can see more optimism in the people about the future. About 1/4 of respondents report that they expect the economic situation in the country to improve. Speaking of the material standing of families, we can see optimism in them as well. Also, about 1/4 of respondents report that their financial standing has improved in a year, and about 1/3 report that their financial standing will improve, so we can see optimism. Speaking of large purchases, we do not see significant dynamics. 16% say it's good time for large purchases, and in general it's aligned with the previous survey wave, and 21% believe that it's a good time for savings, but we can see that they do not really save, but they do spend money. Based on those 5 components, we use the Rosstat CCI methodology. We can see that this index is minus 3.6%, which is for the first time in Belarus, considering a drop at the very beginning of the wave. Today, we can see a discrepancy. We are still waiting for the Rosstat report data, and in Russia it was minus 13%. If we use the Eurostat methodology, it is the 4 components of the financial standing in the country, then the index is minus 2.5%, which in general is the top 5 among all EU countries. In general, in the EU, the index is minus 16%. It grew insignificantly, and today we can see Belarus, Lithuania, and Poland are in the positive zone of the index, which rarely happens. But for Montenegro and Serbia, and the signal that I've mentioned earlier about the changing distance between the financial standing of families and financial situation in the country, the index considers both. But if we look at the dynamics of this, then the share of people who report that the financial standing of their households is bad, or rather bad, is 17%, which is in line with the traditional range, and the number of people who report the financial situation in the country is rather bad, is 26%. We can see a decreasing number of people reporting that. Half of respondents note that the financial standing of the country is neutral or average. And the last element of the base that we use here in the methodology, this is the labor market. We have always mentioned the paradoxical situation in the labor market when there were few layoffs, and people were concerned at the same time because some of their acquaintances lost jobs. In the previous survey wave, we could see a decreasing number of such people, and in this wave, it's basically the same. This is in line with the situation in the labor market, and in every survey wave we ask additional questions that are relevant. In this wave we decided to find out more about price control, how Belarusians treat this, We asked the same question in February 2022, 1 month after price controls were introduced. So we decided to find out what changed in 1 year and in the last quarter. The majority of people support price regulation, price controls. In February this year, of those is 60%, practically as in February 2022. However, this year, of those who are adamant supporters and just supporters, this ratio is different. 29% in January believe that, in February believe that it's right, and 34% believe that it was right. And today we can see a smaller number of adamant supporters, and also among supporters we can clearly see the representatives and those who prefer following the state-run media. They like price controls. The same question was asked by the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Research. It is called also the presidential think tank. So they had a similar figure. About 67% report that now this is a right decision to control prices, but about 52% said that they were adamant supporters. However, our data prove different. If we say if we ask what policies should be pursued in the future, the majority would like price controls to get stricter, or for the price controls to continue. Only 8% want this to be abandoned, and 18% have no answer to the question. And there's another paradox situation. Whether to strengthen price controls or to keep them as they are, people do understand the consequences of price controls. The expected consequences are worse than the reality. Belarusians are afraid that the product range will get smaller, that the quality of goods will get worse, that the number of companies will shut down, but they do not see these consequences. Only 15% of respondents see this in February 2024. However, what they see is the increasing price for goods and services, and as prices grow, they spend more. And now let's move to consumer behavior. In February 2024, almost half of respondents report that they started spending more, 15% more than in summer 2023. However, the situation has not changed at all as far as the consumer behavior is concerned. So 41% do not save, and 30% say that they save less than before. If we give people a choice, and if they have money to be saved, then they prefer having foreign currency in cash. So this is no dollarization. People continue buying foreign currency. The second savings type is procuring real estate in Belarus. We can see booming figures in the real estate market, and this is another preferred option for saving money. 25% believe that now is a good time for buying real estate, and 37% that it's not. And then people keep their deposits in Belarusian rubles, cryptocurrencies, insurance, savings, etc. Those are not the options preferred in Belarus. And let's dwell more on the real estate market. Why this is the situation when we can see a higher interest in the real estate market. The Belarusian households can see two purposes for buying real estate. First, they believe it's a good investment. They believe that sometime after, the cost of real estate or the price for it will grow, and they can see some stability. They believe that real estate is the financial security and stability. And also there's another restraining factor. People believe that real estate is one of the few options for investing money in Belarus. So Belarusian households do not see many options for savings. Regarding mortgages, we can see a paradoxical situation. 54% of respondents believe that mortgages is a way to indebtedness, and at the same time 45% believe that it's a good way to procure real estate. Consumer confidence index has grown significantly. It's minus 3.6% according to the Rosstat methodology. We can see a smaller gap between the financial standing of households and the financial situation in the country. The share of respondents reporting a reduction in income remained at the same level. 61% of respondents support price regulation, and purchasing real estate is the second most popular form of savings or investment. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Violetta. Our next presenter is Dzmitry Kruk, who is going to dwell on the macroeconomic situation. And I would like to ask those of you who watch us in Zoom or YouTube, please ask questions in the chat. These questions will be shared with us, and we will answer them at the end. And participants of the meeting will be able to ask questions here in the conference room. Now the floor goes to Dzmitry. Hello. Thank you, Olga. I will start with a small disclaimer. The first part about households and the rest two presentations are based on different methodologies. In this particular case, we're going to dwell on the statistical indicators. The first part of it is based on surveys. Therefore, there can be significant discrepancies. But our today's case is when this disclaimer is not that critical, because today everything is going to be aligned in the statistics with what Violetta said. And I can see that all of those indicators and trends have aligned. So please let me start with a short summary, and then I will comment each of these points in order for you to have a general picture. This is about Q4 of 2023. The first key thing that we can say, these are just facts, and then we will interpret these facts. It will be in the following slides. So first, what we can say as a fact that the output growth has faded and the GDP level has reached a plateau. This is a significant trend. The growth that accelerated for quite a while in Q4, it stopped. Whether this is the further dynamics, we'll discuss it. In terms of the growth quality and its prospects, including the threats of macro destabilization, is that the jump happened in the domestic demand and in consumer consumption. So this predetermines the risks for the few following quarters. The third thing that materialized in Q4, this is not big news. This is what we have been repeating for the last 3 years. In the external demand, there's a significant turbulence. But speaking of the news, the physical volume of exports, after recovering in summer last year, it dropped for the first time. So this growth has been exhausted. The physical volume of imports shrank somewhat. Counterintuitively, I'm concerned about the import dynamics. The fact is that it has shrunk, and it was not expected. An important trend, a rebound in the state of external conditions. Starting from mid-22, the external conditions worsened. It continued in 2023, but the fourth quarter changed the trend. It reversed the trend. Whether it was a short-term or long-term rebound, we do not know. But the news that is not news is that the real salary growth continues, and this is the baseline for all the trends mentioned by Violetta, and there is still the deficit in the labor market. Lack of workers. So speaking of diagnostics, let's start interpreting these facts and figures. The first key thing is that the economy has probably entered the stage of slowing growth. There are conflicting signals between quarterly data and monthly data, but we can say that this growth slowdown is a reality. However, does that mean that the economic growth would come to zero? In a normal situation, we could even say that it would go to the negative trend. No, we cannot say so. We are in a situation when the existing economic landscape conflicts the plans of the authorities, and this is the key trend for the following few quarters. I've been discussing this situation with my colleagues, and I refer to this conflict by saying a joke. Maybe if you could see it. Maybe you could see a video from Minsk when a person walks in downtown Minsk in strong wind. He tries to go forward, but the wind moves him backward. So the authorities try to push forward, and the situation pushes them back. We do not know what's going to be the ultimate situation. The external environment is still unstable. This is a significant thing. And speaking of the novelty, Starting from Q3, we can see growing macroeconomic disproportions, and this is about the external position and the financial standing of firms. This is what is different versus previous quarters. And now let's break this down into elements, and let me comment the figures. GDP volumes, this is the plateau. We can see that the seasonally adjusted output in Q4 is basically as in Q3. Considering that the output and the economic activity have inertia, these are inertia indicators, we can expect and assume that this is the future dynamics, but this is not physics. So we cannot be adamant saying that this is going to be output, a falling output, but still this may happen. Speaking of the output growth, this is the same curve, but this is linked to output growth. You cannot see the blue bar, but it's there because it is zero. The blue bar is the quarter-to-quarter seasonally adjusted output growth, which shows the recent trends on the economy. To see whether the economy accelerates or slows down. In the previous slide, we could see that it is stuck in the same level. Nevertheless, can I go back one slide? Yes. So this is the level where we are. This level is significantly higher than a year ago. Therefore, annual growth rates are still in the positive range, and they will continue being so. Gradually, this growth will dry up if other conditions are the same. It's important to say that despite the seasonally adjusted quarterly growth is close to zero, labor productivity keeps growing. Mostly, this is the reflection of the trend in the labor market. Labor market shrinks. That would be a good trend under normal conditions. In our conditions, this is a negative footprint of the bad trends of the deficit of labor and the deficit of supply in the labor market. An important thesis that I have already mentioned, this is about the main driver of growth in domestic demand. You can see that this is compared to 2018, and we can see that domestic demand is broken down into red, domestic demand in investments and savings, and yellow is exports and imports. So if external and domestic demand move alongside the GDP line, so they grow at the same pace, it's an ideal situation. We can be speaking about macroeconomic balance. When domestic demand jumps like it was in 2019, this will mean a deterioration of net exports, which is a macroeconomic disproportion, which is a threat to the external position. And this spur that we can see in Q4 of 2023 is the materialization of this threat. And it seems to me that this becomes very relevant. This is the same, so let me skip it. It's just a side view. What is the reason for the spurt in this? We can see real salaries growth, which exceeds the expected level and even wise value. This graph visualizes how, at the backdrop of GDP and amid consumption, if we take 2018 as 100 as a baseline, how salaries exceed any other indicators. Again, the root cause of it is the deficit in the labor market mentioned by companies, reported by companies, and this is also witnessed by households. Therefore, this spurt, a long one, starting from 2022 when recovery started and then salaries growth exceeded the recovery growth concept. Today, this creates this favorable environment mentioned by Violetta, the willingness to consume, and they believe that this situation will continue. When we made our previous monitoring, I was saying that consumption of households stabilized. This growth was insignificant, so I could see the trend that despite growing salaries, households are quite skeptic about prospects, but I was wrong in this diagnosis, in this assumption. So Violetta says that there are growing expectations, and the spurt in the household consumption aligns with these expectations. External demand. The red line is exports. What can we see? Starting from 2022, for the first time, physical volumes decreased. The economy adjusted to sanctions. It was the exports safeguarding mechanism when they tried to push exports to traditional markets or to find new markets. This trend Distinguished participants, we are sorry for this technical hiccup. We continue, and I hope that now everything's going to be okay. There's some echo going. Grew. We can see this in blue bars. Speaking of the dynamics of the real foreign exchange rate, we can say that there is another trend which predetermined the change in the real exchange rate. The blue line shows the exchange rate in the US dollar, and this change stopped, and deflation towards versus the Russian ruble, and strengthening versus the American dollar changed the trend in Q4. This is the dynamics in the real foreign exchange rate. And therefore, the external position, considering these two factors, as said, the fight of physical volumes worsened the situation. This continued until Q4. Another nail in the coffin was the worsening of the price situation, but today they are aligned, and the physical volume decrease worsened the situation, and the pricing parameters improved the situation. Ultimately, the external position in US dollars was negative, and I will refer to that later when showing annual data. Now let's move to the next part: growing macroeconomic imbalances. This is one of the key trends, quality trends, of Q4 2023. The first imbalance leading to domestic imbalance is the elevated level of real salaries. And this becomes more evident if we look at it through the prism of real labor costs. By default, this indicator includes salaries and productivity dynamics. We can clearly see that wages growth, salaries growth, is higher than labor productivity growth. And in mid to long-term perspective, we believe that this can be a proxy of overheated salaries. Salaries expand domestic demand and household consumption. We can see the spurt over the last quarter, but in the long-term perspective, the spurt in household consumption is impressive. If we look at early 2021, about 20%, it's on the left-hand side, this is the red line, about 20% is the growth of household consumption. This disturbs the aggregate demand indicator. The share of household consumption in overall demand exceeds wise limits. If we take a look at the longer prospect, up to 65%, which is similar to foreign countries, this is the share of household consumption. This is another negative fact, another signal showing that there is an overheated domestic demand. Right now, we can see a new trend in 2021, 2022. There was a pipeline of favorable external factors, and there was a field for maneuvering the external position. But today, this maneuvering field has been exhausted. We can see the balance in goods and services. So this is close to zero. In 2023, we could gradually accept the worsening of the external position and to grow domestic demand. But today, this is a quality barrier. After crossing it, this will be a factor of pressure not only on prices but also on the exchange rate, and then the inflation and the price growth spring will grow. There are two important imbalances that are manifested more and more. This is the growing likelihood of financial turbulence. Mostly this is also because of the growing labor costs, deteriorating the financial standing of companies, and also price controls restricting the revenues of companies to grow. Together, these elements create a vulnerable financial position, which becomes a factor for financial destabilization. I believe that Anatoly will dwell more on this. This is about price controls. This is the result of domestic imbalances and overheating. And now, as a summary, if we were in a standard situation, we could say that the economy sees chilling demand and growth can be close to zero, or it can be negative for a short term. This is the background condition for the following quarters. Another thing that we have to keep in mind for the last 3 years, the need for external demand. This is what slows down growth. A new serious barrier to growth will be accumulated macro disproportions, macro imbalances. This is price pressure. In Q4, we are close to the bar of the external position and a growing likelihood of financial turbulence. Most of the data have been classified, and it's difficult to provide more precise estimates, but this trend is seen. Moreover, production barriers. In a number of industries, they have exhausted their production capacity and they face a lack of workers. Therefore, the growth has exhausted itself. But on the other hand, there's a big desire of economic authorities to push this growth, and there are some reserves. They are still kept here, but these are alleged reserves. This is like a person who tries to go against the wind. This is the metaphor. At the top of the slide, you can see higher likelihoods, and at the bottom in italic, you can see smaller likelihoods. So speaking of administrative promotion of exports, this applies to potash fertilizers and petroleum products. This is possible. Potash fertilizers and petroleum products do not mean that production capacity will be fully utilized. These are the two key commodities. If this export is promoted, then this will be the source of growth. Also, directive management of and directive controls of imports is another factor. We could see this in November 2023. Again, authorities try to apply directive controls. They control consumer imports and they try to control investment and then intermediary imports. Also, long-term loans, including real estate, are another factor. Considering that households do not wish to use other saving tools, this can be another growth factor. The likelihood of using other factors for growth is smaller, Those are the factors at the bottom of the slide, but still the authorities hope that this will revitalize economic growth. So conclusions. The economy has entered a slowdown phase. Economic growth has stalled. Domestic demand continues to be a driver of growth. There are macroeconomic imbalances that emerge and become the barrier for further growth, and external demand entered the zone of turbulence. It walks down in the swamped areas, and at any moment of time, it can drain. Macroeconomic imbalances can hinder growth. They become more visible and more threatening to the economy. Therefore, the key conclusion is that the high likelihood of slowing down economic growth, but economic authorities, if we consider their stimulation tools and words, they do not want to agree with this statement. Again, I'm using the metaphor of a person walking against the wind, and all the measures are aimed at expansion. And some of the tools, in order to push the economy forward, are available to the authorities. If the authorities leverage these tools, growth can be pushed. It can be positive, significantly positive, I mean over 1%, closer to 2%, but this will aggravate macroeconomic imbalances and the corresponding demand. This is it. Dmitry, thank you very much. We have a few questions asked online, and we'll be able to answer these questions later. We are passing the floor to Anatoly Kharitonchik, who will dwell on inflation and the monetary environment. Thank you, Olga. Let me start. If we summarize the situation in the monetary environment, then the inflation pressure remains high at the beginning of this year, and this is mostly because of the overheated labor market and economy. This accumulated price pressure, and I measure the overhang as 5%. This could lead to inflation of up to 8 to 10%, but the actions and statements of the authorities indicate the willingness to keep strict price controls in 2024. Therefore, I think there's a higher likelihood of the scenario where inflation can be limited to 5 to 7%, 7% most likely, at the cost of accumulating an inflationary overhang and the threat of expanding commodity deficits. At this background of increasing inflation risks, the National Bank at the end of 2023 was allowed by the government to take measures aimed at limiting and narrowing monetary incentives for private businesses and households. The government is lagging behind the inflation risks. Therefore, the stimulative effects of market interest rates on the economic activity will decline in 2024. However, there's no sign of stricter interest rate policies, and the economic policy is very ad hoc. And I would say that by mid-year, it is possible to get back to this uncontrolled growth stimulation when this impulse provided last year will cease to exist in mid-2024. You can see that inflation accelerated gradually in the second half of last year, and the annualized inflation, we can see seasonally adjusted monthly inflation, and this is expanded to the year, so this is almost 10%. This acceleration could be seen in the base and non-base components of at the end of last year. In February, inflation slowed down significantly, so this indicator is down to 6%. This could be seen in the core and non-core inflation. Price growth in February slowed down for the majority, for the half of enlarged positions, and in Q4 we could see acceleration in price growth for the majority of commodities. So all enlarged components of inflation see the slowing down inflation in terms of goods and services. This inflation dynamics at the beginning of the year can indicate that they are impacted by the price controls, and I believe that the changes introduced in this system as stricter controls. So some civil servants either do not understand or they do not like the idea of having the inflation getting down to 2% and then growing up again to 6%. And in an environment where inflation risks prevail, this change was caused by that. So they decided to make price controls stricter, and the prerequisites for inflation acceleration are visible. One of them, but it's not the key one, this is the high price pressures from the Russian market. It's higher than what was set by the Bank of Russia, and inflation pressure from Russia was balanced by the stronger Belarusian ruble towards the Russian ruble, and then in Q4 this factor was not restraining inflation, and you can see a green area in this graph of valuation of the Belarusian ruble stopped, and now the Belarusian exchange rate is close to equilibrium, and the Belarusian ruble is even undervalued. And also, the weakening of the Belarusian ruble in the end of last year and at the beginning of this year is the outcome of squeezing profit in trade in goods and services, and this collapse was reflected by the forex market. We can see that residents and non-residents stopped being the net source of foreign currency. We can see blue and green bars, so they do not provide net sales of foreign currency. They started even buying some foreign currency. At the same time, households' pressure on the foreign exchange market was not there last year. If we make a seasonal adjustment, then the households were close to balance, and in November they were net sellers of foreign currency. So in February, households can be net sellers of foreign currency if seasonally adjusted. The profit of foreign trade is the overheating of the Belarusian economy. The output gap, the deviation of the real GDP from its balanced neutral level, is more than 2.5%. that was in Q4. So this is the scale of this excessive demand in the economy, shaped through excessively loose monetary policy, growing budgetary expenses and salaries, and an attempt of Belarusian producers to satisfy the overheated demand in Russia by integrating into their military supply chains inter alia. It's noteworthy as follows. In Q2 of 2022, there was a significant negative impact of other factors not directly considered in the model of output gap. This is the effect of sanctions. These sanctions aggravated. Later it diminished because the economy adjusted to the changing environment. Still, it was there in 2023, and in Q4 it even expanded. This is another demonstration that in an environment when the economy, when growing, output reached its productivity ceiling and could not satisfy demand to a large extent, all these three factors that you can see above zero, and this growth has been decreasing, and at the same time inflationary pressure increases. Producers of goods and services have to use their productivity factors like labor, machinery, assets above the optimal level, so costs grow and they raise the prices for commodities and the prices in the consumer markets. As Dzmitry said, there is a significant growth of costs associated with salaries, and on the right hand side you can see a graph, the green zone. This has been growing, and in late Q4 this significantly exceeded its inflationary neutral value. This is the outcome of the shortage of workers in the labor market. A vivid demonstration of this is the ratio of the unemployed to vacancies. This is the red line. This line dropped in Q4, and we can see the ratio of almost 1:1. This is a new minimum value, the new low over the all observation period. The shortage of workers, rapid growth in wages is one of the pricing limiters of the extensive growth of the Belarusian economy and a factor for forming the inflationary pressure. If our inflationary pressure would fully translate into prices last year, then last year inflation could be about 10 to 11%. So 5% higher than what we really had, because the real figure was 5.8%, and this gap is the result of strict price controls. Market inflationary pressure could not translate into real price growth. On the left-hand side, you can see the effect of these price controls on the inflation dynamics. The price pressures aggravating last year nudged the government, as I said, to make price controls stricter. On the other hand, the government prevented the National Bank to take actions to make monetary policy stricter. So the policy was to remove excessive liquidity in the banking system in order for the interbank exchange rate to grow. Consequently, that translated into longer loans and deposit rates, and in order for this transition to be complete, for nothing to be disturbing it, the National Bank increased the estimates of the standard risks, so this sets the maximum values for the interests for corporate and household loans. This is an extravagant and doubtful policy. The actions of the National Bank are not enough to fully remove excessive liquidity. At the beginning of the year, in January and February, this excess liquidity was still high. And also the banks were restricted to access the tools for regulating liquidity. Therefore, the volatility of the interest rates increased. At that, the National Bank set the overnight and deposit rate at the level of 4%, and the overnight loans had 10.5%. So this is the corridor of interest rates set by the National Bank. If there are no strong shocks, then this will guide the interbank interest rates. Liquidity persists. The auction operations aimed at smoothening the interbank interest rate and to balance the core rate. These operations have not been done by the National Bank. Therefore, the interbank interest rate got stuck to the lower bar of the corridor, and it is about 4%. So 4 to 5% interest rate in the interbank exchange market is not restricting to inflation and economic activity. Therefore, the interest rates for loans and deposits have grown, but they are still lower than the inflation neutral levels. So the actions taken by the National Bank at the end of last year caused a limited narrowing of the stimulating effects of the interest rates on the economic policy, but the monetary policy is still loose. Our rates are still affordable to households and corporations, and this is translated into high lending activities. You can see the volume of issued loans, and this is close to historical highs. It is more than 50% higher than the average value in 2021, but the credit impulse, the growth of new loans, has significantly deteriorated at the beginning of last year, and this shows the ceiling of the extensive economic growth in the economy, and even loose monetary policy cannot ensure rapid output growth. According to the latest statements of the National Bank, I have a feeling that the National Bank does not have a clear understanding of the state of the economy and the scale of accumulated imbalances. And also, it does not have a clear picture of the economic prospects for 2024. So the statements of the National Bank are quite contradicting. On the one hand, they say that the National Bank models cannot see the inflationary overhang. A week later, they show us this graph on the left-hand side, where we can see the inflation decomposition according to the base model of the National Bank. And the National Bank shows this gigantic negative model of non-considering factors affecting inflation. This is in line with the Baroque. So this graph says that either the economy has a significant inflationary overhang, or the base model of the National Bank cannot adequately evaluate the situation in the market of Belarus. So the National Bank promotes the neutral nature of the budgetary policy, and on the right-hand side we can see that according to the National Bank, there's a significant positive output gap, or a significant salaries gap. This is an accumulated pro-inflationary pressure. How this could emerge in case of the neutral policy, this is not explained by the National Bank. And on the right-hand side, we can see that the output gap, the blue line, has been expanding for 3 quarters in a row, and the National Bank started responding to this only in the end of 2023. This means that the monetary policy looks backwards, not forward, because monetary policy cannot impact current inflation, but it can impact future inflation, in my view. This shows that the National Bank is not adamant about its assessments of the economic situation in Belarus and the factors of inflation that are present in the economy. And I think that this is the problem of internal communications in the National Bank. Decision makers do not fully trust or listen to those people who generate those forecasts and analytics. And another thing, in my view, the National Bank cannot formulate what the degree of rigidity of the monetary policy complies with the objective of ensuring macroeconomic stability this year. The National Bank representatives communicate the necessity to grow financial indicators, monetary indicators, as stipulated in the targets. So everything is estimated based on the fact that the inflation will be about 4% and the growth will be about that. But we can believe and we can say with 100% probability that this growth, this balanced growth of the Belarusian economy is estimated by the Belarusian economy within the limits of 1%. This is just math, and correspondingly reaching the goal of ensuring GDP growth of 3.8% when the National Bank says that the economy is overheated will only expand this overheat and this imbalance. This is what I mentioned at our last presentation of the monitoring in November. So this prerequisite will expand the economy overheating to 5% or more by the end of this year. There's a feeling that the National Bank hopes that the existing imbalances will evaporate by themselves, since the economy has hit the ceiling and it will not grow fast, even if some economic stimuli persist, and the inflation will be slowed down by strict price controls, and in 2024 this will not significantly deteriorate the financial standing of firms. But this is a dangerous position. I agree, the economy is not going to grow rapidly, even if loose monetary policy persists considering the demand, but loose monetary policy can keep excessive demand in the economy, and the imbalances that already exist will persist, and they will make the economy more fragile to shocks. And if we move to the forecasts, then I believe that the National Bank will continue to be late in responding to the materialization of inflationary risks. Therefore, in 2024, we can expect that the monetary stimulus in the economy will get smaller. Interest rates will grow. In terms of loans, this will be close to 13% in Belarusian rubles by the end of the year. So gradually, they may grow to the neutral level. And if the monetary policy becomes stricter in order to ensure a healthy response to accumulated inflationary threats and pressure, this is not what is seen here. And the narrowing of the monetary stimulus will be felt by private businesses and households because the state-owned enterprises are hedged from changing market conditions because they have access to directed lending. And considering that quasi-emission operations were going on in the end of last year and at the beginning of this year by the buyouts of the government bonds by the National Bank, we can see that this tool of directed lending will be actively used this year in order to camouflage these structural changes in the economy, in order to prevent output decline. This attempt to support the economy through these non-market tools will slow down the returning of the economic activity to its balanced level. We will see a significant slowdown in GDP growth. We have reached the ceiling, and it's difficult to grow outputs more, but the output gap will remain positive. The demand on the economy will stay excessive. This will support imports, and considering growing competition in the Russian market and the slow dynamics in the IT sector and in the transportation sector, this will fix the deficit in foreign trade in goods and services. In the base scenario, I believe this will be about 1% of GDP, but still, in the Belarusian economy, this is already too much. And this may create conditions for the Belarusian ruble to weaken. But this is again in the base scenario. If there are no further shocks, this will make the Belarusian ruble cheaper versus the basket of foreign currencies. And this weakening of the Belarusian ruble, together with the excessive demand in the economy and the shortage of workers, will pressure costs and will create prerequisites for further inflation. Inflation could accelerate in general up to 10% this year. However, as said, the authorities, at least today, change their policy focus on restricting price growth by administrative methods. Therefore, there's a more probable scenario as follows: if the price growth is limited by 5% and if prices for other commodities are not flexible to changing market conditions because of the price controls. If the National Bank ensures gradual growth of interest rates to at least the neutral level, and if the Russian market and the global economy do not see any shocks, then in the end of this year, inflation can be within 5 to 7%, 7% most likely, and this will be at the cost of accumulating imbalance. So this is the base scenario. But the problem is that the likelihood of materialization of this scenario is lower than usual, and the uncertainty factors are more numerous. So voluntarism and the situationalism of the domestic economic policy are there. We can see that the horizon for forecasting of the authorities is limited to a few months. The economic part of the government meets once a quarter. They gather and decide what to do next. The policy priorities and methods for pursuing policies and targets are constantly adjusted, and they are not clearly communicated, and decisions are made ad hoc. Therefore, there's a likelihood of a very strict price control and a stricter monetary policy if the government plans to limit the inflation by 4 to 5%, then there's another option to stimulate growth in order to get closer to the target of GDP growth of 3.8%. This second option will require the price controls to get loose. And this is more probable if the financial standing of firms deteriorates. This is another important risk for the economy, for the forecast. This deterioration can be the result of the actions of the authorities themselves and of the pro-inflationary pressure from the external sector, the risks of which are relatively high today. Therefore, any pro-inflationary pressure from the external sector will significantly limit the capacity of the authorities to use administrative levers in order to limit inflation. At the end of the presentation, go back please. Let's look at this option. As said, I believe that in the middle of this year, the government will in fact be choosing what we should focus on in the economic policy. In the middle of the year, GDP growth, this accumulated GDP growth, the one reported by Belstat, will go down to 1 or 2%. It will be evident and clear that achieving 3.8% target is challenged. This will be a point of no return, and then the government will have to decide either to let the economy slow down further, but this will not lead to accumulating imbalances and excessive demand, so overheating will be there, but it will slow down gradually, and possibly this price controls approach will be exercised. It will have negative consequences, but they will be not manifested short time. Otherwise, the government will decide that somehow it is necessary to get closer to the target indicator of GDP growth, and then the government will be shuffling more coal in the oven, and no matter what decision is taken, both decisions are bad. And rolling back to the previous conditions would be impossible. The difference between these two pathways is as follows. If they take unconditional price regulations, then these consequences will erupt, and this will have negative consequences like inflationary growth and pressure on the foreign exchange rate and the deterioration of the financial standing of households. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anatoly. I'm wondering whether we have any questions from the conference room. If not, then we can start asking questions asked online. Let's do it this way. The question is from one person. There are a few questions, but I will read them out loud altogether, and you will decide how to answer them. If we consider the slowdown of growth in November, then this output will slow down in 2024. And what if this growth will slow down by itself? How can we explain the decomposition of output? If we remove it, will the gap be close to zero? Why expanding external demand was excessive towards the end of the year? The composition of inflation shows practically no impact coming from the output gap. Let me start answering this. Remind me the questions if I forget them. The first one was about the output gap and the impact of that according to the January data. We have already included the January data. In Q1, we can see a rapid slowdown in the annual GDP growth. This is going to be within 2.5%. This will mean that the output gap will get smaller, but it will still be there and it will be significant. And there was a question about 2024, about the base scenario, about the threat of the economy overheating. I believe that this threat is there. If GDP growth slows down and gets 1% at the year end, we can see that it will be about 1% at the year end. Even in this situation, economy overheating will be quite significant. We have not seen it in recent years. This means that we have accumulated a significant share of excessive demand. This will pressure inflation. Well, at least this will create price pressures, and these pressures may erupt. There's another question about the growing excessive demand, why it was excessive towards the output gap. Is it about external demand? Yes. Can we scroll back, please? A bit more? 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 Here. On the left-hand side, we can see the decomposition of the output gap. Yellow inputs are the inputs of external demand. This is because Russian economy is overheated. The output gap in Russia is about 2 to 3%. This is this is seen in the production capacity utilization. It's over 80%, and the labor market situation proves that too. So Belarus tries to satisfy this overheated demand in Russia, and this is concentrated in machine building, etc. So these are the sectors associated with the military domain and consumers, household consumers. So this economic overheating in Russia leads to Belarusian economy overheating. Therefore, production capacity in Belarus is utilized fully, and Belarus tries to satisfy a Russian demand by working extensively. And could we please look at the decomposition of the inflation? We cannot see the contribution of the output. In fact, it's there. It is red. In this graph, for this approach, this is a very high contribution because the key inflation driver is inflationary expectations. Therefore, this add-on, the fact that it is high as in zero, this means that there is the pro-inflationary pressure from GDP, or excessive demand and the deficit of workers. Look here. Look in history. there has never been the contribution of this factor, and this factor affects inflationary expectations. And we can see that even rational expectations grow. Households say that in the surveys organized by the National Bank. And there was a question about the contribution of other factors in the output gap. Well, I've mentioned it. This is the effect of sanctions that got stricter. And right now, this shows the restriction of output by demand. So the output cannot grow as fast as before. Therefore, this contribution is negative. Without it, the overheating, the output gap would be larger. There's another question, or questions asked online. What is going to be the potential inflation in the scenario when the economy continues overheating? It depends on what the overheating is going to be. Evidently, inflation will get higher than. It depends on whether the price controls are strict and what is the scale of the additional stimulus. Inflationary overhang today is about 5%. Then we can assume that if price controls get loose and they continue inflating the economy, then inflation will exceed this limit and will be higher than 10%. But in the meantime, I do not see the authorities to dare to relax price controls, not today. Maybe there are more questions from the conference room. Nadezhda, yes, I'm passing the microphone over to you. Okay. I will try to play the role of propaganda, a skeptic. There were forecasts by independent economists, including those from Iraq, that the growth of 3.8 would not happen, that inflation would be out of control, etc. But nevertheless, there was a good ending of the year. The economic authorities reported everything was great. Is there likelihood that this year your skeptical forecasts will fail? Well, let's rephrase it. What if the reality gets better, and what can influence that? Thank you, Nadezhda. If we look at last year, then this is absolutely fair. When we said that it was very unlikely, because it was unlikely to recover the exports of potash fertilizers. We did not see this opportunity. We thought that the lessons had been learned by the authorities. The likelihood seemed low. In hindsight, all of us are wise, but still, this economic growth was very unexpected last year for the private and public sectors to adjust to a critically new environment and to reach the historical highs of the physical output was not a usual thing, but still there are differences. And in our presentations, we keep saying that we are hitting the ceiling in terms of production and demand. In 2023, these production capacities were visible, and it was hardly expected that the ceiling would be reached. But today, there are just a few technological opportunities for the output to continue growing. Therefore, the only way would be to recover exports of petroleum products and potash fertilizers to the level that was prior to 2022, but this is very unlikely. And the IT sector and the transportation sectors could also grow, but I don't think that IT personnel would stop relocating or would get back from other countries. Some IT guys say that the majority of IT workers have already emigrated, and now we could see the compensatory growth. Well, this may happen. Speaking of the transportation, this depends on the pipelines, gas and oil pipelines of Russia going through Belarus to Europe, and there can be other transportation developments, but I can hardly see them. There's a critical difference between the situation of last year. The reserves are very scarce, the reserves for growth. But the likelihood of these resources to be used is even less this year than last year. Last year it was very unlikely, but the price had to be paid back then was not that high. But if we speak about 3.8%, then this will cost more, and we will have to pay faster. I have an add-on. Last year ended here, in this point, the output gap was 2.5%. So we had space for recovery growth, for faster growth, higher than the potential growth, because we had to recover. Right now we are in this point. Therefore, there is no space for recovery growth. It has been exhausted. These are my estimates, but I used to show you the graph of the National Bank. It's similar to that, and it shows practically the same image. The economy is overheated today, and there is no recovery growth space anymore. Thank you. Tatiana? Tatiana Kalinovska, France Press. Dzmitry has acknowledged he did not forecast, nobody could forecast that the government would be able to recover exports that fast in terms of nitrogen and potash fertilizers, those critical exports. But what do we know about investments? What is the structure of investment? It has been said that the investment is record-breaking. Maybe the government knows anything because they forecast such a growth. Yes, they expect investment, but what are your expectations about investment? Do you see any expectations? Maybe there are some expectations. I scrutinize all mass media, but I have not seen any reference to any large projects, etc. Maybe you have any comment. Look, first I was showing it in my graph. Investment and growth were there in 2023. They were significant, but this was the growth from a very low baseline. The peak of investment was in 2014. So it's not difficult to grow above a very low baseline. If we look at a large picture, then there is an idea pursued by the Ministry of Economy, the idea of a new investment cycle, and I would say that these investments have two routes. One of the routes is directed lending and the monetary stimulus mentioned by Anatoly, and the second route is directed lending itself. When directed lending is under the investment program, they have plans, and therefore enterprises have to implement their investment plans, and This is not paramount factor, but this is one of the factors that deteriorate the financial standing of state enterprises. And second, investments in machinery and equipment are top two. And in my presentation, I referred to that, but it could be seen that they stopped growing. This growth stopped growing in Q4. Monetary conditions deteriorated. And the financial standing of companies is seen here when revenues in 2022 and 2023 were good, and it was possible to redirect that. But now, in the current financial standing, when it is necessary to invest, this will be restraining. Still, I can see. Let me say just a couple of more words. Directed lendings to particular projects. There's an idea of the Ministry of Economy that every district should provide a list of priority projects, and some of the loans will be given directly to these projects. And potentially I can see that there is an effect in the housing investments, and this is limited. So investments in residential areas in housing, this can be working if they work on this. Thank you, Dmitry. There are a few other questions online. Let us answer them quickly. The question is, what are other growth points? You have mentioned it. Is it only petroleum products and potash fertilizers, or woodworking and chemistry? And another question is, what will be the consequences for the economy if military supplies to Russia stop? Well, I think that Dmitry has answered this second question. Well, the construction sector can grow, and this is amid the situations that started in 2019. Speaking of the IT sector, it's unknown. Value added in the IT sector deteriorated by more than 20% versus 2021. It was the peak value in the first quarter of 2021. So our IT sector is like in the second half of 2018. If recovery dynamics are seen there, if the IT sector starts penetrating the Central Asian markets, then maybe there will be some growth, non-inflationary growth. Speaking of industries, in many sectors this has been exhausted. I mean, the space for growth in instrument making, in machine building. These subsectors have record-breaking outputs, so they cannot produce more. Starting from autumn, they are at the highest values, and these values start declining. If military supplies to Russia stop, then this is going to be very painful, rather painful to the Belarusian economy, because when all people are employed, when all enterprises produce to the maximum and then nobody needs it, then this will be a very challenging situation. And Lev Lvovsky has a question. Dmitry, on the one hand, we can see a dropping general supply of labor and low unemployment. The first factor expands productivity, and the second one declines. But the effect is positive in general. Will this remain, or productivity will drop? And is it possible to compensate the shortage of labor by capital? Is there any movement in this direction? I would say that productivity growth should be seen as a mathematical effect, because this is the average value. This is not the very productivity, but just a mathematical effect, the ratio of the dynamics of productivity and employment. If we look at productivity by itself, then I think that the sectoral dynamics should be studied in order to identify any patterns. I can assume that there can be prerequisites for productivity growth if some companies manage to adjust to the existing reality. There are some examples like in the logistics sector. There are narrow subsectors. Then I would say that some of them have identified some options and they introduced new technologies. Those who work in transportation and logistics in this sector, they show higher productivity. There are cases like that, but systemically, I wouldn't say that there are any signs of that in the economy in general. Speaking of substituting shortage with capital, yes, we have to update the study that we used to do with Katerina Barnakova in 2015 and 16, but back then we identified excessive capital in a number of sectors, and an additional capital will not grow general factor productivity. So this is about many things, about economic services and organization of production. And this is a general indicator, and this may fluctuate. We can be speaking about that through the optics of capital, but there is still a question about access to capital, and today the key markets for growth would be Turkey and China, so probably the answer is no. We still have time for a couple of more questions. Using the existing models, can we see the deteriorating quality of statistical data? Well, I cannot say that the models identify that, but we can feel it. There is more and more data classified, so we have to make more estimates. Therefore, conclusions based on these models have more and more discrepancies. This is not good for us researchers. This is not good for businesses who are interested in forecasts and in the current data, and this is bad for many other stakeholders, including the authorities. So I think that it would be useful for all of these stakeholders to get this data. This is also about the quality of data. I was showing you imports. In early 2023, there were spurts in imports. Probably it was associated with imports to Russia through Belarus. So yes, we can say that the data can be disturbed, and then we just guess the baseline model. The base model is just an estimate, and then you do not do your primary job, but you have to find ways to interpret the available data. So yes, we can see some deviations, and we have to explain them by making our own assumptions. There are two more questions. Whether the union programs work efficiently under sanctions, and whether the secondary sanctions are leveled. I will start, and you colleagues will add if you want to. When I hear the word effective or efficient, this can be associated with some criteria or target. If we speak about output, if we look at it through the optics of output, then maybe it's unpleasant to say, but there was some effect, because the union programs are about cheap oil and gas, and the exception of indirect taxes, and there's a very significant effect of access to Russian oil and gas, energy commodities, and this impacts the GDP dynamics. Yes, there is such an effect if we look at it through this prism, but the word effective depends on the criteria, and there are many criteria. Yesterday, this is just a part of the general story. Olga, could you please ask the second question about sanctions? Whether the secondary sanctions have been leveled. Belarus has no indirect sanctions imposed on it. If we look at the executive order adopted by the US towards Chinese and Turkish companies, then this is not indirect sanction. We can call it this way. There are some echoes of it, but we have to make assumptions that are very rough. We do not have facts to prove it. There are individual cases, like Chinese banks. Some Chinese banks state that they would be more cautious when dealing with Russian and Belarusian counterparts, and there were some stories about Chinese banks refusing from working with Belarusian and Russian banks. In Q4, there was a gray bar that has grown. Yes, this can be a proof that this pressure increases, but these are not secondary sanctions or indirect sanctions. So I wouldn't state that the inflationary environment has significantly changed in Q4 in Belarus, but in general this situation is unstable, and we have no reasons to expect that tomorrow this is going to be as today. This is like a bog, and you can submerge into mud waters at any moment. Okay, do we have any more questions? Yes, there are some unanswered questions. We will try to consider them when preparing our next presentation. Our time has expired. Please write to us by email to berok@berok.com, and looking forward to see you in the future. Thank you.